So we're recording this episode on Thursday, January 7th. Excuse me. To be clear, we're all three guys who came together because we're all trainers. That's the kind of common thread that brought us together. So we want to talk about some of the things that are going on, the events that happened last night in the Capitol. But let's be clear, we're not political science experts. I have a degree in accounting. But what I think we can bring to the conversation that may be helpful or useful for anyone is maybe just some thoughts on how to frame conversations, questions maybe we can ask ourselves or other people to maybe make any of the conversations around this or anything for that matter more productive and more effective. And Steve, you had mentioned something a moment ago that I thought was a really good take on that.
Yeah. So as you look at any type of situation where people have an emotional attachment to their position and they are extremely enthusiastic and excited, when you have an emotional outburst of any type and you are trying to react to something that you disagree with, that reaction, is it really getting you where you want to go? Is it really accomplishing what you want? And so many times people will scream and charge at each other and beat each other up because they have a disagreement and they disagree with what the other person's opinion is. And is that charging and beating each other up really the end result that they want? That typically doesn't change hearts and minds by physical violence, or whether it's damaging other property or hurting other people. You're not going to typically get a result from that. I mean, if you look at places like India and Mahatma Gandhi years ago, with just that peace movement, people can make changes, but they don't need to do so in a violent, emotional way, because it rarely has an impact favorably with society when you go into an emotional type of a reaction. Gideon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of like, I feel, first coming from a third world country, my expectations were a little bit, I was in shock for sure. But again, like you say, when you look at it from an emotional crashing moment, you wouldn't be able to learn much. But if you step back and you ask yourself, could this have been done differently? What are we seeing? Do both sides really listen? There are definitely lessons there to be taken home. So there's some elements of wow, there's some elements of how could that happen, and there's some elements of maybe we should process each other's feelings a lot more carefully. And so I feel like what I observed was, momentarily, the lighthouse, which is United States, that gives out a lot of light to the world, became a light ship. By that I mean, a light ship, it's inside the water. It's stirred up. It is in the waves. It's in the rains. All the other ships are passing by. It can also tip over. It can also capsize, which means if it capsizes, the rest of the traffic that's coming through will not have the benefit of that beam of light that directs mariners to sail successfully. So it really showed me the fragility of these institutions, which are so powerful and have given hope to millions of people that have been raised in countries with dictators. So I felt like momentarily the lighthouse became a light ship, and therefore the light ship could also collapse. So it's also something that I want to look at it in terms of us business people, trainers. When we are moderating sessions, there are moments when we cease to be the lighthouse. We get into arguments, fierce arguments with our folks. We become the light ship. and the lightship can lose its way like any other ship. And once it loses its course, many more mariners would sink and perish. That was my initial processing, and I'm still processing it. I'm seeing in terrible
It's still
like
fresh.
details. I'm seeing a lot of details that I'm like, wow, I'm in shock. Like, I'm in real shock, guys, because I'm like, okay, this is unbelievable stuff.
Yeah. So
But
for context, when I got up this morning and put the news on, this is still kind of an ongoing situation. It's not like this is behind us.
yeah,
It just started last night. This
hmm
raid on the Capitol building,
hmm
um, and all the unfolding of things is still going on.
hmm
Gideon, what you said reminded me of something, that situations like this, I think any extreme situation tends to bring out the best and the worst in
that's true.
people. It tends to act like almost like a magnifier, and you will see situations like this. I always think of, I lived in South Florida in 1992 when Hurricane Andrew came through, which at the time was one of the worst uh, hurricanes in history in the United States. And it reminds me of that in the sense that you would see things like people scalping a bag of ice for $20.
Mhm.
And then 5 minutes later, you would drive through a neighborhood and you would see a family on their lawn with a card table and like free hot food with a big sign saying free food
Yep.
to anyone.
Yes, sir.
So, I found it interesting that that magnifier also seems to have shown me the people that have the least seem to have the most empathy. I
That's
think
true.
because they've been through lots of difficulties, it's very easy for them if they see someone else going through something to go, hey, now I know what that feels like. How can I help? Uh, that was kind of one of the first things I thought of. Um, there was something this morning too that I had not heard last night. There were two senators that just, I guess they just happened to be sitting next to each other when all this stuff started. And it was when they were anticipating that the room was going to get breached, that people were actually going to come into the room. And the one senator was a combat veteran, and the other senator had no experience like that. And she said he just looked at her and put his hand on her shoulder and said, hey, we're going to be all right. I got you. He didn't have a gun or anything. It wasn't like he was saying, I'm going to physically take care of whatever. It was really more like an emotional, hey, we're in this together. I got you. Just hang in there. We're going to get through this together. That's, I think, the number one lesson I took from that after that hurricane is I had a tight knit group of friends and family at that time. I grew up in that area, lived there most of my life. And just that simple knowing that, hey, as long as we stick together somehow, some way, I don't even know how, but as long as we stick together, somehow we'll figure this out and we'll get through this. And I think that seems to be the message I'm hearing, starting to hear more and more as a common thread as they show interviews of different
hmm
senators and cabinet members and other leadership. Is this, hey, we got to come together, because a lot of us have not even done that. A lot of us have been more, there's been a
hmm
lot of divisiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Talk about the power of goodwill. It's like this podcast was born, three guys in a rental car was born out of goodwill. I was basically the guy that was going to be either calling Uber back to the hotel, which I could, but you guys offered out of your generosity, hey, come on, jump in, let's go. And then the conversation started. And the conversation has given birth to many things that are good things. Now, you could have just turned your blind eye away, and I would not have had the benefit of knowing you guys better, hanging out with you, sharing some, brunches. I think a beer here and there. Then later on, we went back for the conference. Me and Steve hung out together. So out of that, many, many more things could still be born. So I'm thinking goodwill can really go a long way. So apparently, because of, if you look, but the beauty about United States is that it really trains everyone to look within and ask themselves, what do I bring to the table? And bring out the best in you, even with the differences. But I think another element that we've lost in the course of that is a sense of mutual collectiveness. We still belong to one. In other words, very few countries have been founded on the framework of doesn't matter where you come from, but if you're willing to contribute, participate positively, you're welcome. And so if we can go back to that collectivist mindset, whether it's dealing with the pandemic, whether it's looking after one another, I can guarantee that we will pick up the pieces from yesterday and do a lot better. And the truth is, if you ask the people around the world, they say, United States always tries different things. They always try many, many other options. And when all those options are failed, then they go back to the right thing. And I started seeing the votes that the senators and the other people were casting last night. The votes kind of indicate that, you know what, we've tried those other options. Maybe we'll go back to the best place, which is goodwill and common collectivist survival.
I think that's great observation, Gideon. I think you mentioned another thing. I mean, I know I have gotten a lot out of knowing you, and I'm sure John has as well. The the one component I think that is so important is that all three of us were going off to a conference by ourselves, so to speak, and yet when you get together in a group, you become significantly more thoughtful. You gain so much more by being a part of a group like this. And so there is so much that I've gained from the two of you, but it's been a situation where it's just been a lot of fun, and without having that opportunity, that's one of the things that I think is extremely useful in this society, is that piece that wherever you go, you can make common connections. And we have a whole lot more of things that we agree on than what we disagree on.
Exactly.
And we love to focus on our differences because those things are sometimes the things that we're so emotional about. But the underlying, like you talked about, it's the underlying things, that's like an ocean compared to, the top 1% of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
You just hit the nail on the head, Steve. I wrote this down when Gideon was talking, so I didn't interrupt him. Asking ourselves, what do we have in common? Because when we started hanging out together, it was specifically because we had something in common. Mm-hmm. We had this training that we were there for. And so just because we had that one thing in common, it almost seemed like it was just a natural thing to do. Like, hey, your hotel's right next to ours. Why would you get an Uber? That's silly. Just ride with us. It just seemed natural.
Right.
But it seemed natural because we had something in common. And I think some people today are unfortunately much more focused on what's different than what's the same. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know I've read and heard this a bunch of times, that like we have human beings share like 90-something% the same DNA across the planet.
Oh yeah.
There's just an infinitesimally small percentage of our DNA from person to person that's different. Mm-hmm. We even share something like 90-something% of the same DNA as trees, right? Yes. I mean, it's like ridiculous how much more we have in common than differences we have. But those are the things that we focus on. Mm-hmm. And I think some of it is education. Some of it is nature, right? Because the nature of learning, and Gideon, you're the doctor here, the PhD in education, right? So maybe you can shed some more light on this, but correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the primary ways that we learn is we look at something new that we're trying to learn, and we try to figure out how is it the same or different from something we already know and understand. Like we compare and contrast it. It's like this, but it's different in these ways. And then I think our education system and business practices tend to promote this kind of discernment or differentiation. It's not all negative. I mean, we have to, we're kind of pattern recognition machines, aren't we? To a certain degree. Like we're looking for patterns and things that don't. Yes, we're constantly looking for things that don't fit a pattern because that's a red flag in a lot of cases, right? Gideon, what are your thoughts on how much of these types of emotional reactions are hardwired versus, the whole nature nurture conversation? I believe there's obviously some of both in almost everything. What are your thoughts?
First, I want to acknowledge one thing you mentioned. A guy who studies, is a molecular biologist, or now considers himself more as a neuroscientist or neuroeconomist. Paul J. Zak, one of my favorite people, studies what he calls the moral molecule. And the moral molecule is oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical in the human brain. And when it circulates into the body, it becomes a hormone. He actually lays this out very well. He says, if you go into one forest anywhere in the world, you capture a number of monkeys or gorillas, you synthesize their DNA, you're going to see they look so different. So different. But he said you can get a human from Papua New Guinea, you can get one from China, you can get one from America, from South America, and you break it down to the DNA, they look so similar. So that point you're making is kind of very well documented. But back to the idea of nurture and nature. Nurture, I think, if you look at the nurturing of American democracy, there are written laws, there are unwritten laws. Now, I'm just speaking as a guy who takes some time to read up about the country in which he lives, and I've lived in a number of other countries. The nurturing, there are written rules, there are unwritten rules, but most of those rules have been the unwritten ones, which means, hey, if I agree with you that I'll be somewhere at 6 a.m., no matter what the night was like, I have to get back up and try to be there. That's kind of like we've been nurtured that way here. In some other places, somebody could still show up 30, 40 minutes late and still want to make a case that he or she was there. That's not cool. And I think it's the same thing with American democracy. The founding fathers could not write down everything. If you want to write down every rule that exists, you will not get anything done. So those written or unwritten rules need to find ways to prevail. And in the same light, when we make conversations with friends, with family, every now and then we look at the level of the nurture. But the nature too is, who are we? What are our written codes? When we look at all of those, we combine them, we begin to realize, wow, yesterday was clearly a breakdown in the nurture and in nature. And so we need to go back to the table, perhaps, and look at what you mentioned, John, the common things that hold us together. And acknowledge first the beauty in the other person. I really feel strongly about this. See the beauty in the other person before we criticize them. What is good about the other guy? If we acknowledge that, I think we would at least in some way begin to find or heal the wounds. Don't just come in to critique me, or I shouldn't just come in to critique you, but to say, you know what? Let's, out of the 10 things we're going to talk about, where do we agree? 5, boom. 5, let's make sure that we get these ones done first. Then we focus on the other 5. Why do we tend to focus on the other 5? Because differentiation is what makes us stand out. And in a capitalistic society, differentiation is the one thing that gives us a competitive edge. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that collectively we belong. If the tide rises, it raises all the ships. So we should still start by looking at what is the beauty in the other person, acknowledge that, then we'll go from there. That's my little thing. I don't know if it has nothing to do with my educational background, just my take as a human.
Well, I asked you specifically because I know I won't speak for Steve, but I know you've studied this area a lot more than I have. As you were talking, the word that jumped to my mind was culture, as sort of I guess like a catch-all for some of these different things you're talking about, like the unwritten rules of how we do things. And it just made me think about, I grew up in what I think was a pretty culturally diverse background across the board. As an Army brat, the military is predominantly minorities. I think Hispanics and blacks and other minorities are a larger portion of our United States military forces than others. And having moved around a lot, I think I just grew up not realizing that wasn't like a typical for some people that maybe grew up in the same town and were surrounded by a sort of a homogenous looking and feeling kind of culture. And so to me, it's always seemed strange when people looked at differences negatively. I mean, I can distinctly remember going to friends and asking them about their culture. And it almost feels like today, like you have to be careful if you ask someone because you're concerned that you might offend them by just even bringing up that their culture is different or whatever. Or I really find it odd when I hear people talk about cultural appropriation. Like, hey, you can't cook that food because that food is typical of Latin America and you're not Latino. That's cultural appropriation. And to me, I'm like, are you kidding me? That's one of my favorite things about having friends from different cultures is learning about their cultures. And
exactly.
Hey, dude, can you give me your mom's recipe for that thing that you had at your house the other day? That was awesome.
Yeah.
What do you think about the cultural aspect, Steve?
I think
in general,
I grew up in one town in upstate New York, small town, and it was pretty diverse. It wasn't as diverse as the military. It wasn't diverse. And I never really thought about it. I never thought about the different cultures because it was not, I didn't live in, like, for example, in parts of some of the bigger cities, like in New York, they'll have, an Italian section, and they'll have the Irish section, and they'll have, the Hispanic, et cetera. I didn't live in that at all. It was my schools that I went to were, they were predominantly white, but they were not 100% by any means. And the neighborhood I lived in was probably 80%-ish white. So it was pretty diverse. It was interesting though. There were less Hispanics in our community back then. We had, but I think it kind of goes to, what's really interesting, it goes to that understanding of people and kind of our uniqueness. And you kind of hit on it a little bit, John, in that piece, that if we're more curious as opposed to more fearful about other people, we'll go a lot further along, as long as to some degree we're fearful, because if I ask you a question about your background, you think I'm asking for a reason that might be something an underlying devious reason or something. And if that's what your belief system says, because of people like me that have asked you that question before, you're going to start off defensive. Now, you may never been asked that question before, but you may have been brought up with the concept that, certain people will ask you questions about this. Don't fall into that trap. Here's what they're trying to get to, and so that fearfulness, and it's really just a belief system. That belief system that I think we all have to break away from, that other people, and our parents give us belief systems to protect us. But unfortunately, when they try to protect us, they're limiting us and many of us haven't succeeded as well as we could have because we've got that mindset or that belief system that,
yeah.
you know, you got to have money to make money, or, you know, the rich are, you know, they only get their money by hurting other people, or whatever those beliefs. All of those belief systems are things that really create that fearfulness, and even though we don't even know it's in there, sometimes it prevents us from taking action.
You made me think of the word exposure, in the sense of being exposed to different cultures and different things.
Yeah.
I'd listen to a handful of podcasts that are predominantly military veterans. So they talk a lot about military related things. But a heavy topic in the last year or so for all of them has been resilience. With all that's going on in the world, they talk a lot about how they can kind of share their military experience in, excuse me, building and using resilience to help other people be more resilient just in their everyday life. Excuse me. And they talk about exposure is one of the keys, exposing yourself to some hardship, and especially like with parents and kids, proactively exposing them to some type of failure in a sort of a controlled environment where the cost of failure is very low. And it's like an inoculation. You start inoculating them against dealing ineffectively with failure just by repetition, right? You fail and the parent says, hey, just get back up. Don't worry about it. Learn from it. Keep going. It's cool. Keep going. And I think that exposure also relates to the different cultures, because if you're exposed to those different cultures, I guess I look at it sometimes and I'm baffled at how people see something, see the negative in something, even describing people as a category or whatever. I guess I found it odd because I grew up in such a crazy, diverse family. Even I'll give you an example. When I say crazy diverse, so my mother's maiden name is Smith. Okay, so my cousins on her side of the family, I have a group of cousins. Her oldest brother, they grew up in Panama, country of Panama. Her oldest brother married a woman who was 100% Chinese. So my cousins, their last name is Smith. Their facial features look like traditional Chinese facial features, as we would stereotype them, God forbid. And they speak Spanish. So they would dumbfound people. They would go to school, the first day of school, they'd call roll, they'd call Smith, and this little Chinese-looking kid raises his hand, and then they go to talk to him, and they're speaking Spanish, and people are like, what in the world? What are you? I have an uncle, my mom's youngest brother. He was in the Marines for 20 years, and he said when he first got in the Marines, when you go to the gym, guys worked out in cliques. And they were like almost like racial divides, the white guys, the black guys, the Latino guys. And he said, guys would constantly come up to him and go, what are you, Smith? Because his features were just not stereotypically anything clear to them. But because they were Marines, it was kind of like, whatever, you can work out with us. I guess that commonality thing, it's like, hey, we're all in the same boat. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you are, but it kind of ends at curiosity. I can't figure out what you are from the obvious that I can observe. Right. But now that I've asked it, kind of doesn't really even matter.
Yeah.
And I think the more diversity we're exposed to, the more there's still that curiosity. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter in any kind of judgmental sense. It's just a curiosity.
Yeah. You see, on the surface, we can make a lot of mistakes. Superficially, we can make a lot of mistakes, but if we just pause, I know we started Steve talking about pausing a little bit. If we can just pause for a second, we will start to discover so many interconnections. I just give two brief examples. You can't believe this. So I used to do these storytelling presentations in Nevada, middle of nowhere, in which I'll go into the room and I say, I believe we are more connected than we are. But we don't discover how many connections we possess until we start telling our stories. until we started listening to each other. Then I'll just present myself. I say, I'm this kind of guy. I grew up in Africa. I've come here to go to graduate school. And these are some of the experiences that I've had in life. Every now and then, John, you won't believe it. I will run into somebody who say, wait a minute, where do you say you grew up? Cameroon. I say, yeah. There's a lady in the room who came to listen to a storyteller, didn't know the origin of the guy. She said, you know what? My daughter used to be a Peace Corps in your country. Which city from Cameroon? Bamenda. Are you kidding me? Okay. My daughter taught in your city. And that this is a country with 25 million people. And I'm talking about just 30 people in the room randomly.
Wow.
And then she say, hey, where can I get that dish called Jama Jama? I need it so badly. I'm like, I don't know where to get it for you here. However, stick around. Let's talk at the end of this presentation, because the Cameroon Cultural Society in Reno will be hosting an event in about 1 month. I'm flying out to DC to do a presentation there, but I'll put in touch with my wife. She'll be cooking that meal, and I make sure that you can eat it and you can let her know, or to interact, maybe you get to know where to find more of that. On the surface, when we walk into the room, we're all strangers. But by the time we walk out, when we started telling our story, we're connected. Another guy, I said to them, one of my favorite teachers was an American Peace Corps. I had many of them, but the one that was my favorite was the one that taught math, and another guy that taught biology. And then there's a guy inside that room who said, did you say there was an American who taught math in Cameroon? I said, yes. He said he grew up in Bay Area. He had a teacher from Cameroon who also taught him math. This is a random day. Now, this is like less than 30 people. I saw that over and over and over. When we start to talk and be sincere, be candid, go beyond the superficial, we start to see connections. But the last thing I want to also mention, the second example, is that 2015, I got selected to do a talk in Singapore for TEDx 50th anniversary. They were asking me to talk about different types of Africans. Why? Because Singapore is a tiny little country tucked in the heart of Asia. 6 million people, and there are not too many Africans there, but there are not too many. They asked me, what kind of African are you? Because we see there's so many types. Everywhere I go, they think that I'm African American. And I tell them, no, I'm not African American. I've studied in America, but I cannot claim that. I don't have the African American experience. And I don't speak like a typical African American. But everywhere I go, guess what they're doing? They say, oh, you look like Denzel Washington. Oh, you look like that person. I'm like, no, I don't even look like Denzel. Denzel is much taller. Then I broke down my talk into, I said, as far as I understood, there are like 7 types of Africans. Africans like me, born and raised in Africa. Turns out there are white dudes who have lived for almost 300 years in South Africa who are as African as I am. They're in South Africa, they speak South African languages. Or in Kenya. Then I incidentally had a Chinese guy, just to round up your case, John, who is Chinese South African. His great-great-grandparents migrated from Taiwan. But this guy speaks Zulu and local South African languages more than I could ever learn to, even though I may have a natural African tongue. But on the surface, you see him as a pure Chinese guy. But Mac is not a Chinese guy. He's an African dude. And then I said, okay, there are Africans from Southern America who speak Portuguese. There are Africans who grew up in Europe. They have nothing with the African experience except that they have African skin or the black, if it even means anything. And then I said, there are also, of course, African Americans, then there are immigrants. And I said, it is even hard to define who somebody is. And then I said to them, listen, even though I'm African, I've lived in Singapore for 10 years and I speak the local languages. Then I would say in Chinese, then I would insist that I say, hey guys, you may look at me and look African. I'm actually an African guy, but I'm a Singaporean, and I served in the fire service there. And so don't call me African, call me, as much as you call me African, also call me Singaporean. And then people are like, whoa. So anyway.
Just call me Gideon.
The whole book by its cover thing is, it's interesting too. I wonder.
Fantastic story, Gideon.
I wonder how much you guys have experienced when someone judges you based on whatever, how you look or where they think you're from, or some perception, some surface level perception. I'm curious if you've ever experienced, well, I've experienced quite a bit, where people, they almost get frustrated trying to reconcile their expectation with the reality they faced, right? So just simple example, I grew up in South Florida. Just one time I was out eating, and at the end of the meal, the guy comes and said, "Would you like coffee?" He said it in Spanish. My Spanish is not very good, but good enough that I understood him, and I replied in Spanish. He then immediately started speaking Spanish to me so fast I couldn't understand a word he was saying. Even if I had understood every word, even if I knew every word, I wouldn't have understood it just because how quickly he talked. So I said, whoa. My Spanish is not very good. Could you slow down? Or something along those lines, right? And it turned into an inquisition. He said, "What do you mean you don't speak Spanish? You look Spanish. Where are you from? Where's your mother from? Where's your father from? Do they speak Spanish?" Right? It went to this whole, he literally got angry at me.
Oh my God.
He called me, I believe the term that he used was, they call it un Latino arrepentido, which basically means someone who's ashamed of their culture.
Oh my God.
Apparently there are some people who, they are Latin, but they don't like being Latin, or the perceptions or stereotypes of Latins. So they say they don't speak Spanish, whether they do or not, he thought that's what I was doing. I'm like, dude, my Spanish isn't very good. Long story why, but that's just, have you guys ever encountered like a situation where someone thought you were something? Oh, you're not what I thought you were. And then it just kind of messed up it threw them off.
It's interesting, and I get it probably significantly less than you two, just because of my background, and I'm a little more stereotypical, Caucasian guy. But I had my last name is Karski, and I had a guy reach out to me on Facebook recently, and he said, "Karski, is that Polish?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "So where are you from?" Now, that question by itself made me think, well, he thinks I'm from Poland because that's my last name. He knows I'm,
right. What does the question even mean?
I'm not speaking to him. He doesn't, but so I said, I have at least 4 generations in the United States. Where I am from in Poland, I have no idea. and I'm only about maybe 10% Polish. But anyways, it was a situation where, well, do you speak Polish? Well, again, just like you, John, it's been decades that my family has lived in the United States. Just like Gideon talked about with the gentleman in South Africa, how can he possibly be able to speak Chinese when his family's lived in South Africa for generations?
Even that simple question, where are you from? I have had so many times that's turned into a long conversation, because somebody might ask me that and I might say, "Oh, Charlotte." They're like, no, like, where are your parents from?
Right. Yeah.
And as soon as they ask about your parents, now I'm thinking, okay, they're not asking me where I live or where my parents live. They're thinking, what's your ethnic background, right?
And I think they're looking for things in common, which is a natural
no
thing to do.
Yeah.
But rather in a way that is not very instructive or constructive, if I may. And I think that's the kind of question that if our folks were to ask yesterday, we might not have seen some of those scenes that we saw. Yes, there is pain on both sides. And if we could tie this in, yes, there is pain everywhere. But if you dial back a little bit and you take the questions a little bit, get to know the person first, and the rest would unveil itself. So if I may, I'll say, if both sides of the aisle can talk more about what holds us together, about what the beauty they see in the other person's ideas, and not condemn them, I think we'll get to a place whereby we can begin to recreate that fabric that the founding fathers had. That was a very beautiful vision. Had it not been that way, I think, honestly, America would not have held together. So, but the fact that those guys were very idealistic, yes, they were as human as me and you, but they were equally very, very idealistic, and it's what has held them together to now. So when I went to visit Jefferson's house not too long ago, some people were saying all kinds of negative things. I said, no, forget about it. I love him for who he was. He was a genius. He didn't talk much. He was a brilliant guy. Yes, he had his humanity, but if you can discard all someone's weaknesses, what else do you remain of? What remains of that person? So I like the fact that he was brilliant, and yes, he had his own humanity. And I want people to see me for who I am. And yes, I have my own humanity, but take the best of what we have, see the beauty in the other. That's my way that I would say.
And you make a really good point, Gideon, because when this country started, they did not just all agree on the outcome of that vision. I mean, they were fervently arguing about their points, and then once that vision was decided, that's when they united together and moved forward. So even though nobody had that one vision, it was collectively brought together, and they were extremely emotional about their own positions about the way it should be designed. So very interesting.
Tony, just
John?
one quick thing, and then I just realized it's a few minutes after 10 and Gideon's got to take off. Tony Robbins has a question that he talks about. He says that all behaviors have at their core a positive intent, even those that on the surface seem negative, right? And what he coaches people to ask themselves and or the other person, if they're interacting with somebody about some specific behavior, what is the positive intent underneath here? And he uses an extreme example of like the Nazis in World War II exterminating the Jews. Well, how could there possibly be any positive anything there? His point was, in their mind, in the Nazis' mind, they had what they believed to be a positive intent. So it's not a moral judgment of what we think is positive or negative, but what is this person in their mind perceiving as the positive intent that's driving their behavior? And if we can at least start to understand that, it gives us a better starting point to go, okay, I think at least I understand a little better where he's coming from. I still think he's a little twisted or he's off or he's wrong or whatever our judgment is, right? I mean, if there's violence involved, I got a moral issue with that. But I can still try to ask that question. These people that were storming the Capitol, somewhere in their mind were thinking that there's a wrong going on that I'm helping correct. And as much as I disagree with how they went about doing that, and maybe even their logic or whatever, that at least helps me understand, okay, that's what's driving that behavior. So if maybe somehow that helps get the conversation started to try to, resolve some of this stuff. I've always found that question hard to remember in the heat of the moment, but very instructive if you sit back and think about it.
It's a great way to end this segment, John. Very well stated, and I love that question.